Hi, Ken.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. My apologies. I'm new to the, as you know, pretty new to the whole
There's
Instagram
always
thing.
a lot of flicking and pushing buttons and hoping for the best, but we made it right on time. So it's 10 a.m. and we've got a lovely turnout. So thank you everybody who's joined us. Yeah, we might have time for some questions at the end, but I think in the meanwhile, I just wanted to say, for one, I'm wearing my forest endangered Forest Alliance um, t-shirt, which you were a co-founder of, right, Ken?
Yeah, that's right. Back in 2010, I
Right.
set up Endangered Ancient Forest Alliance, but now
Ancient
I
Forest Alliance, yeah.
yeah
Yeah.
have a new organization.
Yeah, and now you are the founder of the Endangered Ecosystems Alliance, right?
That's right. So I now run a new national organization, but that still has a large emphasis on BC's old growth forests.
Yeah, yeah, and here we are. So, I mean, people who've been following on my account will have noticed that I've been really kind of, I guess, pushing a lot of what is going on with the ancient forests and old growth forests in BC, and it's become quite high profile what's going on with especially the very shocking pictures that TJ Watt posted about with the before and afters of a 1,000 year and plus trees that have been cut down. We've got the likes of Brian Adams involved now. We've got Cole Sprouse interested, and so it's getting real attention in BC, but not only here but globally, right?
Yes, I'm
Um,
so grateful you're bringing the star power to bear on one of the most important environmental issues in the world. Really, the fate of our ancient forests.
Yeah, and I think a part of that is because it's such we're like down to the wire now, aren't we? Really feels like the 11th hour at a time when we're in global crisis all around us. We just see the effects of the climate crisis, and still we cut down trees. We cut down some of the most important trees. So why don't we just get into some of the really key points here? So what is an old growth forest?
Yeah, I mean, depending on where you live in the world, you may not always, not everyone's familiar with old growth forests. In British Columbia, of course, most people will know. In California with the redwoods, Oregon, Washington, I think a lot of Americans on the West Coast have some familiarity with old growth forests, but not all of your fans will necessarily know exactly what they are. Basically, these are old forests that have not had a history of any industrial logging, and where the oldest trees, not all the trees, but the oldest trees can often be 150 years old, 500 years old, 1,000 years old, and they have specific characteristics that are not replicated by the plantations that are replacing them. So specific things need old growth forests. They can't live in the younger forests.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so these are the places where you're kind of like walking in the cathedrals of nature, where the trees are as tall as a downtown skyscraper, as
Yeah.
wide as a living room. These are the biggest, oldest living organisms that have ever existed in Earth's history. The
Yeah.
giant old growth trees here in North America.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as people know from my accent, I'm from South Africa, and then I lived for a long time in New Zealand, and we just don't experience that kind of tree. I mean, I had no knowledge of trees of this age even existing outside of, legend, lore. There's one in New Zealand, which is called Tane Mahuta, which essentially just means big tree, and it's the oldest and biggest, tallest tree that's still standing. But they change the coordinates, like they don't release the coordinates of that tree, so people can't find it and damage it. Like there's one. So then I arrive here in BC to shoot Riverdale, and get to go to Lynn Valley and see 800-year-old trees, 1,200-year-old trees, and I just was absolutely blown away and assumed they'd be protected. So,
Yes.
this is why it just blows my mind that they're being cut down as if they didn't matter and as if we weren't in a climate crisis. So, going back to what an old growth forest is and what these amazing trees are, can you tell us why they're important?
Yeah, well, the old growth forests, they're obviously cool to look at, but there's actually a lot more reasons beyond their aesthetics why they're important. These ancient forests store more carbon per hectare than even the tropical rainforests do. These are temperate rainforests because you
Yeah,
got different kinds of rainforests. Temperate rainforests are the ones in Canada, US, New Zealand actually has some parts of Australia where you have seasons still. So you have winter and summer and fall and spring, but there's a lot of rainfall. So they're rainforests. in the temperate rainforest here, we have more carbon per hectare stored in these ancient trees and their tree trunks, the live vegetation in the soils as well, than per hectare, even more than in the Amazon. They're also important. Yeah, it's pretty spectacular. It's like they're the greatest carbon storage ecosystems. You also have a whole lot of species at risk, endangered species, that if you cut them down, just replant the trees, they're still going to go extinct anyways. Spotted owls, mountain caribou, marbled murrelets, a whole variety of smaller organisms that have to have old growth forests. And they're vital for tourism and recreation, for providing clean water, including the people of Vancouver get their drinking water from the old growth forests of the North Shore. And they're vital for First Nations cultures whose unceded lands these are. These are technically, legally, First Nations lands that have not been given up in the vast majority of areas.
Right, right. So there's a whole history of issues that need to be addressed. Um, uh, so when people say I mean, you've touched on it already with your answer, but when people say it's okay, it's a tree, you cut it down, you grow it again. Why is that not actually possible?
Yeah, because the issue is not just about the tree per se, whether trees grow back.
Yeah,
It's an ecosystem issue. It's whether the ensuing second growth plantations adequately replicate the original old growth forests that they were replacing. And the fact is they don't. Our plantations are relogged every 50 to 60 years on the coast. No one's waiting 500 years or 2,000 years. That'd be a lot of patience. I'm just going to wait another 2,000 years. It's so essentially it's like forest mining, right? Once you log the old growth forests under our industrial system, you're not
yeah,
going to see them back in many, many, many human lifetimes. And so they've got structural differences from this plantations that multi-layered canopies, well-developed understories, lots of woody debris, and so science kind of describes it all, that are not replicated by the tree plantations. It takes time, and no one's waiting 500 years.
yeah, yeah. I mean, to just try and put one's mind back to when these trees were first came into existence, were first seeded. You know, you go back 100 years, you go back 200 years, 300 years. What did the world look like then? 1,000 years ago? Where are we
Yeah.
going to be in 1,000 years from now, 2,000 years from now? It's, you know, the mind boggles, and most people don't actually stop to think what that actually means, what these trees have seen, and how long it would take for them to get into the state they're in now. It's virtually impossible. But also, you know, what is the assumption in terms of all the species that depend on these trees and the ecosystems they create? What happens to the salmon that manages to live on the pristine waters that these ecosystems create? What happens to the caribou and the other species that you mentioned? What happens to them?
Yeah, they go extinct, and here's a hell of a story. It makes my blood boil every time I look at it and think about it. But there used to be over 500 breeding pairs of spotted owls in British Columbia. That's about 1,000 adults, probably another 1,000 juveniles. So about 2,000 spotted owls. They live in the old growth temperate rainforests around Vancouver. By 1990, there were only 200 left. By the year 2000, there were only 3 dozen left, 30 or 40. Now, there's one breeding pair and one other individual. There's 3 left in the wilds of British Columbia. The British Columbian government just put a 1-year moratorium on logging of the old growth in the last place of the 3 spotted owls. They're cutting it pretty close. This is going on for species after species, endangered area after endangered area. And yeah, basically things go extinct. You lose them because their habitat is not replicated by the 100-year-old or the 50-year-old plantations that are
Yeah,
coming up.
they can't just move on into the next bit of forest that's nearby, or the next early young forest that's a second or third growth forest, right? They don't just move on, they die. It's just to
Yeah.
make it as blunt as that's what happens to them. So for that hope kind of, it's okay, we've got tons of forest all over the place. Look at BC. It's not the same forest.
No, no,
Um,
yeah.
no,
Yeah, they've got
carry on.
breeding facilities, right? They've got a owl breeding facility, but the key thing is you need a place where you can release them to so that they can actually have a viable population.
100%. I mean, you know, coming from wildlife rehabilitation training in South Africa and the work that I do with, you know, the rhino, whatever, there are so many endangered animals that orangutan when I went to Borneo. It's all very well breeding animals. It's like panda in China when panda were about to go extinct. What does it matter if there's no environment to release them into? So, you
Yeah.
know, the fact that it's that we're here in a first world country, very progressive on so many levels, first world country in Canada, and this is happening. You know, the first question is, where are the regulations to protect these endangered species?
Yeah. So the British Columbian government was supposed to come up with standalone species at risk legislation, basically a provincial law to protect them. They basically dropped that. Once they, sort of like this government, they campaign like they're environmentalists before they're in power. Once they come to power, it's basically the status quo. Major old growth logging across the province, the Site C mega dam in northern BC, liquid natural gas projects. But they have, now on old growth, mind you, okay, one thing that's different is that they have opened the door for potential major policy change, even though they don't really want to do it, right? Because they're doing everything they can to still spin the situation, drag it down, but they know that the momentum is massive. It's partly the Fairy Creek blockades. It's also a much bigger movement involving a lot, hundreds of thousands of citizens and First Nations whose
Yeah.
unceded territories these are. So the winds of change have come. They have to change things,
Yeah.
but they're still kicking and dragging and finding all manner of loopholes for their little weasel-lid heads to pop through and find ways to evade the.
Yeah, and just
the
delay, right? And all of these delays allow more forest to be logged, and more doubt to creep in. And the protesters and the people like us who care, environmentalists, concerned citizens who need change to happen. And I guess that's what politicians do. They wait for people to run out of steam and to give up, right? So what are their reasons for dragging their heels? Can you tell us a little bit about the excuses that are used in terms of why old growth should be logged?
Okay, well, it should be explained that not only is British Columbia one of the only major jurisdictions on Earth with these thousand-year-old giants, we're also one of the last jurisdictions where the large-scale industrial logging of those forest giants is still happening. It's not some sort of like one-off thing, in the corner of the province. There's about 50,000 hectares, 500 square kilometers of old growth that are being logged every year in British Columbia. And so there's a big industry. Basically, old growth wood is used for a variety of things. It could be for 2x4s, for lumber, also for pulp and paper, for toilet paper, for in some areas for the wood pellet industry. Largely, it's the solid wood products industry. But you can make a house out of a 100-year-old tree. You don't need a 1,000-year-old tree.
Yeah.
The rest of the Western industrialized world is logging second, third growth forests. That's the alternative. You see basically a whole lot of the straw man arguments being trotted out. Oh, what are you going to wipe your butt with? What are you going to make a house with? This has got zero to do with not having a house or wiping your butt. We're talking about whether you need to use old growth trees versus the regular second growth. We need to log second growth sustainably, let some of it age to become old growth because we log so much old growth. But there's a massive timber industry, basically, and the government has been doing a lot of spin and sophistry. The big one here is that not all old growth forests are created equal. There's a lot of bogs where you get these little bonsai trees. They're very tiny. They're only like maybe like 8 feet high, 10 feet high, but they're like, I'm 1,000 years old. I'm a great grandfather. But no one's logging those little bonsai trees, but they are old growth, and there's a lot of it. That's where vast areas of old growth are basically in bogs and in subalpine high elevation landscapes. The classic forest giants it's called high productivity landscapes where the trees grow quick. There's only 3% of those left. Moderate productivity is about 20%. So it's in the moderate and high productivity areas where logging occurs. But most of the old growth, by a long shot, 80% is low productivity. So what basically the government's plan is this: it's to confuse the public, to save the small old growth, log the big old growth, and to mix in all the numbers together so it looks like there's a lot left and a lot's being saved.
So yeah, let's stick with that. So what are the real numbers? Like you say, there have been so many numbers being thrown around. I've had a lot of posts from people who are supported by the BC forestry industry. They're enraged. They don't want their jobs taken away. They say there's so much forest left, so much old growth left, throwing all kinds of random numbers around. But the real true numbers of what remains of these big old giants, can you tell us what those numbers are?
Yeah, so there's 10.6 million hectares of low productivity old growth. That's basically the areas that grow small trees of little to no value, mainly to the timber industry. There's about 2.6 million hectares. Contrast that to 10.6 million, 2.6 million hectares of moderate productivity old growth. So that's where you have some scattered big trees, and the industry is targeting that hard. But the core of the debate, historically and still is today, is the high productivity. It's the monumental stands of the classic forest giants, the grandest trees, where you get a lot of those big giants that all the tourists come to see, and all the photos are of that. Yeah. There's only 400,000 hectares, whereas there's actually 380,000 hectares of the second highest class. Of the highest class, they're really the most spectacular ancient forest you'll ever see. There's only 35,000 hectares left. It's like not even a teeny fraction of 1% of what there used to be. So we're getting down to the fractions of a fraction.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, you know, people tuning in from overseas, if you have a look at how enormous BC is, I mean, Canada is massive. BC is huge. So 35,000 hectares, that's the number you said, right? That's It's nothing. It's a
95 million hectares. The whole province is 95 million hectares. So that's and so we're still having to fight. You know, here's what I remember. Years ago in the Redwoods, there was only 1% of the Redwoods left, and there were 10,000 people blockading the logging road on one day. 1,000 people got arrested. Protests everywhere over the Redwoods. And still, over that last 1%, they had to fight it out. And it shows me that there's no degree of scarcity that will cause a corporation to self-regulate if they can make money by logging it to the very end. It's about building citizens movements to put handcuffs on those companies so that we can keep some of these ancient giants. You know, it's no different than massacring the last of the great whales or the elephants and rhinos. These are the charismatic megaflora.
Yeah, I think it's part of that corporate attitude, right? Where you can blame it on somebody else and blame it on somebody else until the last one's gone, and then you go, oh, sorry, I don't know how that happened. So you know, let's talk, and we'll get to how people can help at the end, because everybody can help, and they already have been helping in an incredible way, and we're so grateful. Thank you, everybody who has written letters and made the phone calls to the NDP. But you don't just have to be from BC or Canada. You can do it from anywhere in the world, because what we do affects you and the old growth left in the rest of the world, right? But let's speak a little bit about the First Nations positions on old growth logging, because that is absolutely key. So these are the Indigenous communities, as you say, whose land we're on their unceded territory, and there is a history that was never addressed in terms of land protection. And what are you working on right now, Ken, in terms of First Nations involvement, and how that can help save these forests?
Yeah, so it's important to know that First Nations, they're highly diverse across the province, with languages as different as Italian is to Chinese, right? There's many different nations, and these, in the vast majority of cases, there's no treaties signed, so it is legally, technically, still their land, upheld by the courts, and so no major land use change can occur without the meaningful consultation with First Nations. But on the level of a government, ultimately First Nations are going to decide what happens to the land and the old growth forests in British Columbia. Many First Nations have conservation champions and are pushing for Indigenous protected and conserved areas, IPCAs, to protect landscapes and old growth forests. First Nations were the ones who really began the battles to save old growth forests with conservationists in the 1980s in Clayoquot Sound around Tofino. But many First Nations in the last 15 years, and this is no accident, have had successive provincial governments foster an economic path dependency on old growth logging in the most contentious areas, with limited, as a result of the history of colonialism, racism, and very few economic opportunities in these marginalized communities. When government comes forward with jobs to log the last old growth or to have some revenue sharing agreements, you choose between extreme poverty or you take what you can. And now the government's environment. Yeah, they've been pigeonholed as a result of, and the rest of Western civilization basically has logged the hell out of the whole thing. So now this opportunity has come up in the last few years. The only way to ensure the protection of old growth forests, this is important for all of the forest activists out there to know right now in British Columbia, is First Nations decide what happens to their territory. They need an economic alternative that's equivalent and sustainable compared to the timber revenues and jobs that are going on. And you'll see the hand strengthened of the ancient forest champions in all these indigenous communities to get these areas protected. But the provincial government and the federal governments are the ones who've got the financing on that scale. Unless any of you listening to this have connections to those who can bring in a few millions to get the ball started, its government has got to finance the alternative to get the logging deferrals and the protection for indigenous protected areas and to build up tourism, sustainable seafood, renewable energy, non-timber forest products like wild mushroom harvesting, a variety of industries for First Nations. That's what I'm working on, is to leverage with First Nations, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and others, the provincial financing that enables the immediate logging deferrals to happen and the protection of these areas. Government's moving on these things, but they're sly, right? They're going to try to starve the First Nations of key financing, and they're going to try to save the small trees and log the big trees still.
Yeah. I've just got a comment here from Adrian, my friend Adrian, who brought me in on this. Adrian, you're a superstar.
He's awesome.
Yeah,
thank God.
And Adrian. And so Adrian is saying the forestry industry is subsidized to the tune of $365 million a year. What do you want to say about that, Ken?
Yeah, there's different ways industry is subsidized, but one of them is, there's this endless dispute with the Americans between Canada and the US over lumber, and a lot of that is because basically the BC government has been allowing the logging companies here to get away with paying very little for their wood compared to the timber auction in the US. So the big subsidy is essentially not paying the value of the wood so they can liquidate the last of these ancient forests. There's other things as well, but yeah.
And this reminds me of when I went to Borneo when I was campaigning for the it's a palm oil free anti palm oil plantation campaign that I've been part of since 2017 to try and save the orangutan and all the species that are dying because of the loss of rainforest there. One of the things that came out of the discussions with the locals was that as soon as you get other countries involved in your old growth forests, your rainforests, if you aren't prepared as the indigenous people to cut them down because you are also controlled by your poverty and the corporations that offer you a small fee to destroy your environment so that you can buy food for your family, if you aren't prepared to do that, they'll get the neighboring country to come in and do it for you because they don't connect to your land. And in the case of Indonesia, Javanese would come in because their rainforests have already been eradicated. And to get their small subsistence fee, they would be cutting down the rainforests in Indonesia. And I think, in a small kind of way, if you're talking about how America will cut down Canada's forests, it's a weirdness, isn't it? Where you kind of go, well, I don't have to think about it because it comes from somewhere else. It's another country and it's their environment. And so there's that disconnect that happens where before you know it, an industry affects another industry in a very, very negative way.
Yes, like the markets are American and Japanese and Chinese largely, and some European, but these are largely Canadian companies, but it doesn't matter who's doing it. It's not sustainable. There's a second growth alternative. There's no bloody reason why it's like sort of arguing that you're not going to be able to eat unless you kill rhinos and elephants and whales. There's other things you can do. You don't need to cut 1,000-year-old trees, 500-year-old trees to make lumber and toilet paper. So
yeah, absolutely. I think I'm talking about the disconnect that happens, first where you are ordering products, getting involved in sustainability in your own country, but then not considering the sustainability of other countries, right? Anyway, in Canada, let's talk about the second and third growth forests that can they sustain all of our needs?
Yeah, I mean,
and the world's needs.
Yeah, most of the 97% of the high productivity forests in British Columbia are second growth now. So if the industry is going to argue that they're going to collapse because they can't subsist on the other 97%, that's a total argument for their mismanagement of the resource the whole way through. There's a second growth industry in British Columbia is inevitable when the last of the unprotected old growth is logged. We're simply saying that they've got to make that transition now while we still have the last of the 3% of high productivity and 20% of medium productivity, as opposed to when it's gone. So it's going to happen anyways. Let's do it in a planned, rational approach. Do it quick. Right now, there's got to be deferrals. At the heart of the issue is the high productivity old growth. There's got to be immediate deferrals, and the BC government is trying to essentially evade that issue by all sorts of fantastic wordsmithing and contortion.
So how do we get things to go faster? How do we speed this up?
There's several things. Okay, one thing is people should join the call to push the provincial government, and we're going to do a federal call soon, to help finance First Nations sustainable economic alternatives to old growth logging and support Indigenous protected areas. We've got an action alert that's got only about 6,000 people now, but it should be really in the hundreds of thousands to support First Nations old growth protection initiatives.
How do we sign on to that? How do we?
You go to the Endangered Ecosystems Alliance Facebook or our website, then I'll put it up at the top again, and we'll make sure it's right at the top.
Yeah, and I will post it on. I'll put it on my profile, right? So that will be a link in my profile, and sign on to that petition, please. Everybody that's listening, everybody who listens to this when I post this live interview later, and please share. So that's one of the things you can do.
Yes, and there's other ways you can volunteer, right? Depending on what you're interested in doing. Hats off to the people blockading in Fairy Creek. If you want to take part in the blockades, I spent all the 90s blockading. There's an important role, a tool in the toolbox that creates sparks and catalysts that to put the issue in the spotlight that focuses people's attention. So it moves to the forefront, and instead isn't melted in that mushy oversaturation of too much information in today's society. So. But there's you don't have to blockade and get arrested to make a difference. We need people in all manner of things. We need people to help do outreach to different faith. We have a resolution we're going to be circulating, so you'll see that pop up very shortly. Circulate the resolutions and get support of churches, of businesses, of unions, of recreation groups, environmental groups around the world. Share it on social media, make it go far and wide. Donate to groups that are working to save old growth forests.
Can you mention some of the ones that you would to donate to?
Well, obviously, I'm a little bit biased in that Endangered Ecosystems Alliance is playing an important role, but there's a whole lot of them in the province. I used to run Ancient Forest Alliance. I know the Fairy Creek activists have been raising a lot of through crowdsource fundraising. It's been going pretty well, I think, for them. But you've got a variety of organizations. Sierra Club of BC has done some good work, and there's like a British Columbia's environmental movement. The modern one was built on the battle for ancient forests. So there's a lot of groups working there, but I would just put it that the governments are largely worried about three things, right? One of them is the economy. And so when it comes to old growth wood products like Western red cedar, don't buy that. Another one is, you'll see cedar everywhere, by the way, throughout the US, and it's largely 95% comes from British Columbia, mainly old growth. Another thing is help with the outreach campaigns, obviously, that I just listed. And if you're in British Columbia as well, the government's, it's a brutal concept, but they're primarily concerned about swing voters and swing ridings. So follow what's going on in the politics. The honest truth right now is the Green Party is the only one that is really championing protection of old growth forests. And they may sweep, southern Vancouver Island. So, figure out where the levers are to push the province to actually save old growth. And the donations are key.
Sorry, what is that?
Oh, and to donate, of course, because donations are key.
Yeah, great. And so, I mean, if people have various skills or just some time on their hands, they may not be able to donate, they may not be able to go out to the blockades. Can they contact you at Endangered Ecosystems Alliance and say, how can I help?
Yes. So it's just info@endangeredecosystemsalliance.org. But if you just go to our website, Endangered Ecosystems Alliance, you can get in touch. And we just have a new volunteer coordinator who's going to be helping to do major outreach. And it's basically, my philosophy here is that it's a large-scale, broad-based movement of diverse people that fundamentally changes the outcome. No one tactic or tool in the toolbox is going to change it. No one group of people. It'll be a large, diverse group going at it from different ways that will ultimately change the outcome. This province, the government's vulnerable. And First Nations, many of them are ready to move on ending old growth logging in their territories. They
Right.
need an alternative, right? They need some key financing to supplant the major timber revenues going on.
Right, right, right. Okay, so that sounds like a good starting point. Obviously, time is of the essence, and I mean, from my side, everybody who's listening, and again, your friends, anyone you can share with, is to keep the pressure up. There are so many ways that you can help, and as much as the government drags its heels, you just got to keep going and keep pushing. I want to give a huge shout out to the protesters at Ferry Creek. You can maybe
Yeah.
talk a little bit about how Ferry Creek has gotten this issue. I mean, it's been in the public eye before, but Ferry Creek is getting global attention at the moment. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Ken, and how long they've been there and what they're doing?
Yeah, so the Ferry Creek protests are occurring in an intact valley, the last one outside of protected areas on southern Vancouver Island, filled with old growth forests near Port Renfrew, southern Vancouver Island. In August, I believe they started blockading there. Now there's about half a dozen locations in that region where people are getting ready to blockade, and if logging resumes in those areas, the company has gone to court to get an injunction. In
Yeah.
British Columbia, they use a court injunction process. It's sort of a convoluted approach to
Yeah, what happens
remove.
with that if they get the injunction?
Yeah, so basically, they're going to be uh, they'll basically be violating court orders. So if then there has to be an enforcement order. So there's still another step there, and then the RCMP, the Canadian police, there will move in and start arresting people. I imagine there's a long history of blockades and protests in British Columbia. So I
Yeah.
imagine some people will climb up trees, and but sooner or later, blockades do fall. But blockades do fall. But what it will do in the meantime is buy a little time in those areas. It'll create some sparks that is pushing on